Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, episode 63. My name, as always, is Dr. David C. Noe. It hasn't changed since last time. And I'm here in the vomitorium on an autumnal Saturday afternoon with my good friend and co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. Winkle. How are you, Jeff?
I'm feeling good, although I would say it's more wintry than autumnal.
You would say wintry?
Did you see that snow out there?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like Zeus is throwing snow cones all over the landscape.
It's no good. It's no good. It's too early for me.
It's snow good. That's right.
It is snow good. But my boys are out there this morning. They made, before it melted,
right.
They made giant snowballs, and they were all into it. They were excited. So.
Yeah. My children wanted to do that too, my child anyway.
Yeah.
So we could say there's a kind of slush all over the world tonight.
There is, exactly. But I'm feeling good.
Yes.
And I'm ready to dig into this very interesting topic we got today.
And today is your birthday.
It is. I didn't want to say anything.
Okay, but I had to.
Okay, yes.
So Mishka can insert a little birthday music here for our fabulous co-host.
Yes, thank you. Yeah,
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Right. It will not be my birthday when this airs.
No.
But that means this is how low it's gotten. What am I doing on my birthday? I'm recording this
You're
podcast.
Felicissimum Natale. Happy birthday. Happiest of birthdays. So we got a shout out.
We do.
Yes, and let me get this one started. This goes to a Mr. George R. McClarty, New York City, born and raised. And he says, I'd like a shout out and something to be read.
This is new.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's blazing a new path. He says, why the classics? Because it appeals to that secret depth of the human soul, where shadows of other worlds and other lives pass like the shadows of nameless and soundless ships.
Did George write that?
I don't think so. He said borrowed from Vladimir Nabokov.
Okay, all right.
And he says, our muses are perished, withered are our laurels, ruined is our Parnassus. The woods are all become mute, the valleys and mountains for sorrow are grown deaf. Nymphs or satyrs are found no more among the woods. The shepherds have lost their song. Ooh. Which is from Jacopo Sanazzano, the epilogue to Arcadia.
Okay. That's very sad.
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful.
And we have to thank George because he did some of the show prep this week.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, here you go. Read this.
Right.
There's a show. That's a show. We could just end it right here.
So I'm taking that he sees our podcast perhaps as an answer to this dirge here. Right?
Yeah, something along those lines.
To awaken the woods once again.
Right. What's less than an answer? What's not as definitive or impressive as an answer? A whimper, maybe?
A whimper?
This is a whimper in response.
A whimpering response? Yes, right. Okay.
Instead of cursing the darkness by some matches, yes. I think that's the phrase.
It is better to light a single candle than to curse the dark.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing. I guess the cursing of the darkness comes after the break.
That's right. Segment 2 or 3.
Yes, all right. So, Jeff, what are we giving the listener today?
Well, apparently we are going to teach people or show people how to be a Latin guru.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
You think this is doable?
I don't know.
Okay.
In 1 hour? Probably not.
Probably not.
But we'd like to trace out some of the steps that they could take to go from a grammatical knowledge and only grammatical or deductive knowledge of the language to a more active knowledge and a more useful knowledge, you might say.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Now, I don't bill myself as a guru or Svenjali, I think it's pronounced.
Svenjali.
Yeah, I'm more of a Sven Irascible, you might say.
That's right, exactly.
But I have learned some things over the years.
Yes, you have. I can attest to that.
Right, yep. And I've been blessed to know some of the best Latin speakers in the world, either as close friends or at least acquaintances. And so we want to just lay out for the audience how you can take your Latin study to the next level.
Yeah.
And as a Latinist yourself, Jeff, along the way we're going to see some of the things that have worked for you, some of your own memories and experiences about your engagement with this incredible language.
Right. And I would say that my knowledge of Latin, the way that I've taught Latin, has been almost exclusively grammatical.
Okay.
And from reading.
Right.
And I've participated in some stuff with you with the spoken Latin, but it's really something that I've never really picked your brain about. And so I'm eager to get to it.
I hope you brought some gloves.
So it doesn't get messy.
Oh, it's going to be a mess. Absolutely. So we got an opening quote, right? We got an opening quote, and this comes from a book that was written in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, Ni Falor. by someone named Francois Waquet. It's called Latin, or the Empire of a Sign, from the 16th to the 20th centuries. And Jeff, you're going to read us a quote from that, right? It's quite a lengthy quote, but it's just packed with interesting material.
Yeah, here we go. Catholic or Protestant, 17th century schoolboys throughout Europe all did Latin. And so, of course, did their Orthodox contemporaries. In Peter the Great's Russia, there appeared schools copied from the Jesuit colleges, like the one in Kiev, which offered a classical curriculum. The academy in Moscow was reformed following the same model at the beginning of the 18th century, when schools like those at Chernigov in the Ukraine, Rostov, and
That's a tough one.
I wasn't prepared for all this Russian.
Novgorod
were also established. By 1750, there were 26 colleges in the Russian Empire offering an education based on a Latin curriculum. Latin was not only the daily bread of collegians in Europe, but in the New World as well. The school system established in the American colonies was modeled on what was done in England. The first transatlantic secondary school to be founded, the Boston Latin School, derived its pedagogic approach from the English grammar schools in ancient languages, Latin to the fore. It formed the essence of the education given there.
Right.
Please.
We could just pause there and interact with that a little bit. It's surprising how successful and popular Latin was in Russia.
That's brand new to me. Yeah.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yep. So maybe if we have any listeners in Kyiv or Novgorod, Rostov, these places. I've never been to Russia. Have you?
I have not.
I would really, really like to visit.
That would be fascinating.
Yes,
right?
a great fan of Russian literature, which I can only read in English translation.
Right.
But they were studying Latin. And the first school, of course, here in the New World, as Waquet calls it, was the Boston Latin School, which is probably still in existence.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
And hopefully still teaches Latin.
Have you read this book, by the way?
I have.
Yeah.
Cover to cover.
I mean, just this quote, it sounds fascinating.
I loved it. Absorbed every word. Now, since that time, I have spoken to some other students of the history of the Latin language. They have a lot to criticize about this book. Says that it is, they say that it is guilty of some severe misunderstandings in places, a misreading of the evidence and so forth. I don't really feel adequate to judge on that. I haven't done the research myself. We should maybe devote a future episode just to the book. But for me, I learned a tremendous amount from it. One of the little anecdotes before you continue on to this great quote is that in some places where speaking in Latin was obligatory for the students of the schools, if you spoke a word of the vulgar tongue while you were there, you had to put on a hat that was shaped like a donkey, and you had to wear it around for the rest of the day.
Really?
You were the designated asinus.
My God. So that's even worse than the dunce cap sitting in the corner.
Oh, it's much worse.
You had to wear it around.
You had to wear it around the whole day. You peer out from donkey eyes because you had transgressed. You were speaking a vulgar tongue, not Latin.
Wow.
Now, shame is probably not a very compassionate motivation. Let's just be honest. But it can be very effective. And in some cases it was.
You've never gone to those links, though, in your own classroom.
I have not. I have been tempted. I've told the story, but I've never done it. So.
Yeah. All right, let me pick it up. All these children who started on Latin very young, sometimes even when learning to read, had to absorb and churn out truly stupefying volumes of Latin over the period of their schooling. And the task was every bit as grueling in the English grammar schools as in the Jesuit colleges of Catholic Europe. Sir Simons de Ways claimed that a pupil at Bury St. Edmunds in the early 17th century, he had composed more than 2,800 Latin and Greek verses. William Lilly recalled that as a schoolboy in Ashby de la Zouche, he could make extempora verses on any theme, all kinds of verses, hexameter, pentameter, plaluchiacs, iambics, sapphics, etc. A century later, a Turin youth called Vittorio Alfieri competed with a college friend in the recitation of Latin verses. To his great shame, he was regularly beaten by his rival, who could recite up to 600 lines of Virgil's Georgics at a time without getting a syllable wrong, while I couldn't even do 400, and not as well either.
Oh, what a loser.
What a loser. Only 400?
Not even 400 lines. Crested around 370, and that's it?
That's it, exactly. Let's get this guy fitted for a donkey hat.
Yeah. I know the first couple lines of the first Georgic, Ticta tu patulai recabon subtegmina fagi. That's about it.
Yeah.
And that's not even a Georgic.
No.
That's an eclogue.
No,
That's an eclogue.
All the elements of memorization that were part of my schooling in Latin and Greek, I have almost permanently flushed from my memory.
Why did you do that, Wingo?
I don't know. It just happened.
Yes, it happens, right.
So
we're going to talk later a little bit about the value of memorization when it comes to appropriating Latin.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about that. But it's difficult for sure.
Right. Just a little bit more here. Many other performances with numbers of this sort could be quoted, but they would be no more eloquent than the astonished reaction of little John Waldegrave, age 7, on his arrival at Eton. He judged it a very odd place, full of boys and Latin. Yeah.
Poor little John Waldegrave.
Man.
Drop him off at Eton, right?
Right.
His mom pushes him out of the carriage, right? Here's your bologna sandwich. Run in there and start to study. And he says, so odd, full of boys and Latin. That's it.
Everywhere. That's great.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today, for the listeners' sake, about some ways to develop a quotidian, that is a quotidian Latin vocabulary. So we're going to talk about my experience moving from the grammatical-based knowledge to hopefully a more active, and trying to learn how to speak Latin, share some tips about the joys and the pitfalls. And Jeff, we're going to rely a little bit later in the episode on the Duck Book, right?
The Duck Book, yes. The first 1,000 words in Latin, right?
Right. And this is written by Heather Amory with illustrations by Stephen Cartwright. Now, as an illustrator yourself, the listener may not know this, but Dr. Winkle, in a previous life, was a syndicated cartoonist.
Well, yes.
You were syndicated?
Very, very briefly.
What counts as syndication?
Well,
in more than one newspaper at the same time,
I suppose, right? It was kind of a trial deal, briefly syndicated. It was an online thing. So anybody conjuring up images of like Calvin and Hobbes in their heads, nothing like that.
So who were your characters, though?
My character.
Don't get all humble braggy now.
My character.
Okay.
Was a kind of an advice columnist by the name of Ed Fargle.
Ed Fargle.
Yes, and he answered questions that people would send in, but he answered them in the most absurd and unhelpful fashion.
Okay.
Right.
Do you have an example?
Not off the top of my
Okay.
head. If the listener wants to dig through some like dusty internet archives, you could probably find them out.
Fargle.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Ed Fargle, and people would ask him questions.
Yes.
And he would give really bad answers
and then
bad advice.
And then I would illustrate as the cartoon,
Right.
Something to kind of extend the joke.
Right.
Yep.
So as an experienced syndicated cartoonist like yourself, what do you think of Cartwright's illustrations for this book, First 1,000 Words in Latin?
You know what they actually reminded me a lot of is of Richard Scarry. Did you grow up
the
with
Great Big Schoolhouse?
Yeah.
Cars
and Trucks and Things That Go.
Yes,
that kind of
and
stuff.
there's a worm. What's his name?
Lowly Worm.
Lowly, yeah.
Right, but it's a similar kind of.
Can you tell by the tone of my voice?
Yeah, you
not all that impressed.
You didn't like it?
I like the illustrations, but what I find in so many children's books, no plot.
Right.
Plot.
There was no plot in Richard Scarry. There was, a lot of things happening in busy town. Right.
As the name implies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But it's a similar kind of conceit. Whereas in this book, you look for the duck, right?
Okay.
The hidden duck. You had to look for Goldbug in Richard Scarry.
Oh, really?
Yes, he's hidden on every page.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Maybe knowing about Goldbug now. Mm-hmm. Is that some kind of a medicated foot powder?
Right.
That may
prevents chafing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That may improve my appreciation of Richard Scarry.
It had nothing to do with foot powder if you're basing your judgment on that.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
I didn't really get into that too much.
Yeah. My boys loved him.
Another one I hate while we're on the topic is Curious George.
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
The curious thing about that is where's the story? Right?
Where's the story? And every story is the same.
Right.
Curious George screws something up,
right?
And then something else is to come in to make it right, and then everybody's happy with George for fixing his own mistake. Right. Yeah.
If as though that constitutes a plot, right? Just a stream of consciousness monkey. Right?
Yeah.
I don't mind the drawings once again.
Yeah.
But
it's okay.
Where's the story?
Right, their story. So this book, this first 1,000 words, how could that have a story?
Well, it doesn't have a story, but see, I'm so interested in it because I want to appropriate and stuff into my mind all these 1,000 words.
Gotcha.
So Heather Amory, the editor, Stephen Cartwright, the illustrator, and our friend Patrick Owens was the Latin consultant.
Oh, he was?
Yes, and spent a great deal of time on this book, hammering out, narrowing down, finding with great specificity the accuracy of each one of these offerings to the reader.
That's excellent. Now, you may have already said it. When did this book come out?
I don't know. Let me check here. Shuffle some papers around so the listener thinks we're doing something worthwhile. Buying time. 2014.
Okay. Well, so fairly recent.
Based on a previous title, first published in 1979. It's by Usborne.
Okay.
Which is in London, not far from Eton, I think, where poor little John Waldegrave
Found all those boys and all that Latin.
dropped off. Right. So let's get right into it.
Let's do it. Yeah. Do you want to start? You want to start talking about your own journey in Latin, kind of how you got into it, how you started learning, and what your kind of your experience was?
Right. Sure. So we can put this all into the Wayback Machine and take us back to 1993.
Okay. Wow.
So
almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, I was 20 years old then, right? I was 20 years old then, so the reader can do some math if they want to. You knew, did I say reader? Listener, sorry.
Yeah.
The listener knew we were a couple of old guys all along, right?
Right.
Okay.
So they can do some math here.
Sure.
Right.
1993, and I had been taking Greek for a little while now, about a year and a half. And Ken Bratt, who was on this show before, for the Philippi archaeology episode, he said, David, you should add some Latin to your study of Greek. Okay, I guess you seem like you know what you're doing. Maybe I've told the story on air before. So I picked up Latin, and for one summer, I went through Wheelock. I don't know, it was the 5th edition, maybe the 4th edition, and I just poured through it all summer. I was working manual labor during the day, full day of hard labor, and then in the evening, I had a kind of a literary retirement, and I really credit it to God's providence that I was able to have the most productive summer of my life, probably, because I did all of Wheelock in that 3.5 month space.
Wow.
And it really stuck. So I had a tutor, a fellow named John Bergsma. He came by every Wednesday evening and would answer questions that had arisen. But the other thing that helped was our former professor, Dr. Rich Weavers, had written this program. I think that you must have used it also.
I think it came with quizzes that you could take.
Correct.
On the computer. This is before online anything.
Oh,
right?
yes. I think these were 5 1/4.
Yeah.
Maybe 3.5 inch floppies, but almost certainly they were 5 1/4 floppies.
Yeah.
Right?
They were huge. You could serve food on them. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I'd set my coffee cup on one of those, but on accident, So you slip one of those in there, and then it just scrolls on the screen. No graphics whatsoever. Just all text.
All text. Yeah.
But he had used COBOL, which I had to do some research here. The Common Business-Oriented Language is what COBOL stands for.
I've never heard of that before.
You've never heard of the COBOL language?
No.
Oh, yeah. It was big.
Really?
Replaced punch cards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then
Maybe it ran on punch cards.
But this has since been replaced by many other...
Oh, C++ and Java and all that kind of stuff.
I know nothing
I don't
about that stuff.
even know.
Yeah.
Python and Piglet. There's probably not a Piglet programming language, but there ought to be. COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language. And he had basically inputted all the paradigms that you can find at the front of Wheelock and in Gildersleeve's Latin. And I went through tens of thousands of iterations, of learning do, das, dot, damas, datas, dant, kiwis, kiwi, kiwim, kiwe, and so forth.
Right.
Mara, maris, etc. And just tens of thousands of iterations. So by the end of the summer, just because of this kind of brute effort, I had a pretty comprehensive knowledge of the forms of the language.
And then did you in terms of the classes that you took, did you do test into like a higher level? Or?
I did.
Okay.
I did. And looking back, the tests were easier than, if Ken Bratt's listening, maybe turn this part off. The tests were easier than the kind I give now. I give more demanding tests than the ones I took then.
Yeah.
But I scored really high.
Okay.
Like a 98 and a 99.
Oh, wow.
And I had never done that well on anything.
Okay.
I was a strong B+ student in everything. It wasn't hard for me to do pretty well.
That must have been a huge confidence boost.
Tremendous. Right. I think I grew 3 inches that summer after I took that test. Because here I had done really well on something that was brand new.
Yeah.
It was a huge confidence booster.
Now, in relation to your learning, you started with Greek.
Right.
When you were a freshman or a sophomore or when?
Right. I came in the middle of the year in the spring of 91.
Okay.
You were still kicking around Calvin then.
I was.
Today's your birthday. You're a little superannuated, but you were still there.
I was.
Yeah. And so then the fall of 92 is when I started Greek. So I had done about 2.5 semesters of Greek before starting in on Latin.
Gotcha.
So same kind of thing though, right? B+, and then started studying classical languages. Suddenly I'm motivated. I start doing well.
Yeah.
Right? And great teachers, of course. I mean, I don't deserve really any credit for this, but it was wonderful. And I just took to the Latin. Then I got dropped into a Virgil class. I got dropped into medieval Latin, those kinds of things.
Right. Now, Dave, you mentioned some of the texts that you read, and we share them in common, like the Far Virgil. I remember that
Yes.
one, or others. Were there ones that you remember saying, this was really helpful, I like this, or I didn't like it?
I liked the Far Virgil, although now in hindsight, once again, I think it's too helpful.
There's too much on the page.
It glosses almost every word. And, it was a great benefit to me. And apparently there's some kind of a syndrome. My son was telling me about this a while ago. I can't remember the name of it. But it's the syndrome whereby once you become an expert in something, you go really deep on something that's very small. You forget what it was like not to know very much about it.
That's very true.
So you accidentally exaggerate other people's ability to approach it.
Yes.
So that could be happening with me a little bit.
Yes.
In other words, I think that far page is stuffed with information too much. Let Virgil speak for himself.
Right.
But it's only after all of that study that maybe I can see it.
Yeah, exactly. I remember really liking that text as well. In particular, the purple hardcover.
Yes,
that I really
liked
enjoyed.
that too, and I liked the fact that it was cloth.
Yeah,
it seemed like a valuable book.
I did. Do you still have yours?
Somewhere.
I got mine.
It got pretty beaten up.
Yeah. Yes, I think right now I would agree with you. Too much on the page
Right.
there, but it allowed me to really focus more on kind of the music of the language.
You're right.
And not so much manic flipping.
Correct.
To the back or in a dictionary.
Right.
And so I liked that.
I did too.
And
gave some speed, some rapidity to the work.
Right. And I think it's one of the reasons that I still love Virgil.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How can you not love Virgil, frankly? But another really memorable event in my acquisition of Latin was that we were reading a survey course. This was it would have been a second year course. It was my first actual semester in a classroom, after the independent study.
Yeah.
But it was selections from Roman history. I can't remember the author of the book. I can remember the color. It was gray. Do you remember this one?
With the red writing.
The red letters
Yes.
on the front, and they were in a kind of Trajan inscription sort of font.
Oh, yes. I can see it, but I couldn't tell you the author.
Right. And the really nice thing about it is that unlike the far text, I don't think there were any helps on the page. There were some in the back, and then George Harris, whom we've talked about before, of blessed memory, Beate Memoriae, was a booming voice.
Yeah.
And an Ontario hockey player, farm boy, really incredible guy.
Yeah.
He would add in and provide all of the missing material.
That's right. Yep. I took that same class.
Right.
Yep.
And so I was prepping something which, until just last night, when prepping this episode, I thought was from the historian Livy. So I've kept this phrase in my memory since 1993, fall of 93, and it is the ablative absolute orta seditione. So orta seditione. So seditio is, as the English derivative implies, sedition, mutiny, disagreement. And orta is from orior or riri, to rise up.
So a sedition having arisen.
Yes, that's right. So when mutiny broke out, something like that.
Right.
And I was prepping for this test, and I was prepping all night, and I had learned it really, really well. And I went in the next day for the test, and as often happens with Latin teachers, you assign, say, 30 items, but then you only test on 10.
Yeah.
So the idea is the student needs to learn all of it, but then you don't actually test them on all of it because it's not possible. And so we got to the part of the phrase, which I have since learned is not Livy at all. It's Tacitus, Annales, Book 12, Section 54, if you're interested. And this phrase, orta seditione, was left off the test because it was one of the parts removed. And I remembered it. So I actually wrote it in on the test.
You hoping for some extra credit?
Yeah, I wrote it in on the test and translated it. And then later, Dr. Harris said, why did you put that in there? And I said, well, because I remembered it and I didn't want it to go to waste. A small victory, but for me, really meaningful.
Yes. And when you explained that to George Harris, did he kind of tip the cap and say, "Well done, sir"?
No, I think he gave me one of his gentlemanly harumphs.
I remember them well.
Yeah, a very lovely man, good-natured. But he had seen a couple thousand undergrads by that point. I was not going to impress him with that. But,
Gotcha. Yeah.
and I wasn't really trying to, maybe a little.
But the fact that you remembered
yes,
it,
it was a sweet victory.
Yeah.
And that is such a motivator when it comes to more study.
Without a doubt.
Right. I can do this. So then I went on, and we were talking a little bit before the episode, reading Primer of Medieval Latin.
Yes.
You remember that one?
I remember not liking it.
Yeah, I didn't like it much either.
Yeah.
In part because you spend so much time with COBOL, learning all the forms, And then you find out the Venerable Bede, he's cut some corners on the grammar.
Right.
So,
He's quasi-venerable.
I don't know what the opposite of venerable is. Devenerable?
Devenerable,
I don't think so. An anthology of prose and verse. So this is by Charles Beeson, still in print. But I think I still have my blue hardcover, hardback version of that.
I got the orange paperbacks. It's just a very unattractive book.
Makes it worse.
Yeah.
Interesting how the color and the aesthetics of books shade our perception.
I judge books by their covers
do.
all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
It's too early for the Hackett ad. Anyway, one of the really memorable parts of that book that I absolutely loved was a poem, which is O Sacred Head, translated O Sacred Head, Now Wounded, by Bernard of Clairvaux, right?
Yeah.
Whose dates I just happened to know because I was teaching on him this week, 1090 to 1153.
Okay.
So the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th. And at the same time as I was reading this medieval Latin, I was reading Calvin's Institutes in English, and Calvin quotes Bernard more than any other father except Augustine.
Is that right?
Yes, a great admirer of Bernard, or Bernard maybe.
Yeah.
Someone's gonna send us an email, no doubt. Who's that guy down in Australia?
Oh, Ron.
It could be Ron.
Ron. He doesn't like the way we pronounce things. Or
Yeah, it's Brisbane. He said Brisbane.
yes, he gently corrects
Ask him.
our ignorance.
Right.
Yeah.
A very generous fellow.
Yes.
But in any event, Bernard, maybe, if you're listening, Ron, we're not going to make Ron into a running gag, are we? Poor Ron.
Unless he wants to be.
And so Bernard of Clairvaux, very much admired by both Calvin and Luther. And so I thought, wow, this is interesting poetry, right? So it goes like this: Salve caput cruentatum, totum spinis coordinatum, conquessatum, vulneratum, arundina sic verberatum, facie sputis illita. Salve quies dulcus vultus, immutatus et incultus, immutavit suum floridrem, totus versus in palordrem, quem coeli tremit cura.
It's got kind of a Dr. Seuss rhythm.
You're
to
right.
It.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the reasons I was fascinated by this was I liked rhyming a lot before I encountered Greek and Latin, right? The rhyming of children's books, the rhyming of pop songs, other kinds of things. I loved rhyming. But then I learned classical Latin doesn't rhyme.
No.
Classical Greek doesn't rhyme.
I remember on a grad school
Right.
exam. Did I tell this story already?
I don't think so, but tell it again.
Yes, I remember that there was a question about a couple of lines of poetry.
Right.
I don't even remember who the classical author was. And I had nothing.
You did tell this before, but tell it again because it's lovely.
So I had nothing, and so I felt I got to write something down. Right? So I should have just wrote down "Orta seditione."
Yeah.
But I wrote that the lines were important because they happened to rhyme.
Oh.
Right. And he got back and said,
You got a snarky comment?
There's no rhyming in classical Latin.
That's true. There is internal rhyme. There's rhyme within a line. I should have conjured up an example. Maybe after the break, we'll give an example of internal rhyme, but never at the end of the line.
At the end of the line, there's no like a pop song. You don't see that, right?
No. But I thought, this is good. It's easy to memorize, and it's really good Latin. It's beautiful. It's, hail the head that's wounded, all crowned with thorns, beaten, wounded, whipped with reeds, arundina sic verberatum, the face, facie sputis illita. So Bernard, beautiful. And that has stuck. Snippets of that have stuck since 1994, I think.
Yeah.
And that's just because when you're learning something in another language, now the listener may dispute this, the older I get, I find the easier it is to memorize Latin than to remember English things because the unfamiliarity of it. Right? We get so much English, if you're an English speaker, whatever your native language is, you get so much of that. Something in another language has an unfamiliarity to it, so it's tacky, it sticks.
Interesting.
So it may be a little harder to get in, but once you get it in, it's there with a kind of permanence.
That's interesting. I think that goes against what I think most conventional wisdom would say. The older you get,
right,
you learning a new language is forget about it.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think that's right.
That's really interesting.
I don't
like
think
that.
that's right.
Yeah.
So then we move on to grad school. But first, Jeff,
Yes.
let's hear a little bit about your experience. You started Latin
Yes.
a lot earlier than I did.
It did. I did. It was offered in my high school.
Okay.
Where it is no longer offered at my high school.
So this is the Cursing the Darkness.
This is the bit of the Cursing of the Darkness.
Okay.
The program there died with when my Latin teacher retired. But I had a great teacher. His name was Chuck Ostindi. He loved Latin. And now that I'm thinking about it, he incorporated a lot of spoken Latin.
Right.
I mean, he didn't teach us that way, but
Right.
I mean, he brought that element in. But I took Latin. It was only I'm trying to think. It was offered for 2 years, and so I took it as a junior and a senior in high school.
With Dan Voetberg.
With Dan Voetberg, exactly, a recent shout out.
Right.
And I mean, the other offerings, I mean, you could take at my high school, you could take Spanish, of course. They had French and German, and then also Latin. And the reason I took Latin was really because my parents really pushed me to take it. They had taken it in high school and in college. They drilled into me kind of its practicality in terms of vocabulary,
right.
and also kind of its link to the ancient world, which they knew that I was interested in already by that time. And so I kind of said, I'm an easygoing guy. I said, yeah, sure, why not?
Right.
The other languages didn't really interest me.
Like my response to Ken Bratt, right?
Yeah.
Hey, take Latin. Okay.
Oh, okay. Right, I'll do it. And so, yeah, and it was great. I really enjoyed it. And it wasn't, sometimes you'll hear about Latin programs in high school being 80% toga parties and 20% language. It was not. It was.
I got to go finish that thought, but I got an anecdote on that.
So, no, just to say that my teacher, Mr. Ostindi, he really drilled the grammar, and I felt like I learned Latin very well in those 2 years.
And what kinds of things did you read before my anecdote?
I think we did. It was not Ecce Romani,
okay,
but it was a text very much like that.
Right.
I just remember it was filled with lots of semi-disturbing, off-putting pictures. Right.
Richard Scarry kind of.
It was kind of Richard Scarry. So I don't remember the text that we used. I remember the class time being a balancing between reading the grammar, studying the grammar, and linking it to something cultural from antiquity, and that's what I loved. And it wasn't just okay, we're doing this. Part A and now part B something different. He always made it connect to, even if the sentence was, your dog is wandering about.
Kannst du es erraten?
Right. Very good. Right. And I remember the lesson where we were learning the word for dog.
Right.
And we got the famous Cowie Canem from Pompeii. Right. Right. And so it was great stuff like that. And I loved it.
Yep. Which reminds me of the Far Side cartoon, with the guys crouched behind the tree, and there's the front door, and there's a beware of Doug sign.
It's one of my favorites.
It's genius.
It is genius.
Brilliant. Sounds like a good teacher.
He was a very good teacher.
What was his name again?
Chuck Ostindi.
Ostindi,
yeah.
Yeah, that's good teaching is what that is, I would say.
Yep.
Now the anecdote. Now this is not personal, but it's something I read. It's got to be a kind of a whopper, and that is many of the schools, you talk about grammar instruction, language, but 70% toga parties and so forth. The Latin word for a cudgel, right? A knobbed stick.
Yes.
Is fustus.
Fustus.
F-U-S-T-I-S. Fustus. That's one of the words you can use for something with which to beat a person. Baculum is another one, right? So you want to put together, a society of young Latin students. One particularly notorious high school had the Fustus Latina.
The cudgel.
The Latin club. That's one of those instances in which you got to read down a little further in the dictionary entry.
Right.
Because it's equivocation.
Do we have time for another quick anecdote along those same lines?
Yeah, let's hear it.
So back in the day, this has got to be about 10 years ago when I was still teaching Latin. I gave my students an optional extra credit assignment. It was like a last day of the semester kind of fun thing.
You're a generous fellow.
Yes.
Part of Fustus Latina.
And what they could do is that I said you had to translate a pop song into Latin and then turn it in as a text. But to get the extra credit, you had to perform it.
Oh.
Right? And so not a lot of people went for it.
Was this the origin of Walk This Way by Aerosmith?
It might be.
Because you sent me that one time.
Exactly. I translated it into the dactylic hexameter. So maybe we should read that sometime. So a few kids did it. And I remember one of my students wanted to do Elton John's Rocket Man. Right? And so what he did, not really realizing that there's probably not an ancient Latin word for a rocket.
No, not an ancient Latin word.
Right. But he didn't search for like a Neo-Latin. He went to, are you familiar with William Whitaker's Words?
Yes, I am.
So a search engine by which you can search for words, from English to Latin or from Latin to English. And he typed into English to Latin, he typed in the word rocket. And what he got was I believe it was rucetta as a first declension noun. R-U-C-H-E-T-T-A.
Okay.
Which translated to rocket. Not realizing that rocket.
Oh, it's a vegetable.
It's arugula. So he came in and he sang and performed Wir Ruketai. The man he thought it was with the man of a rocket, and it was Arugula Man.
Oh, that's
And
terrible.
it wasn't. It was awesome. It was fabulous.
You liked it.
I did. I enjoyed it very, very much. Yep. But exactly, he should he should have dug a little deeper.
So I'm on pages 20 and 21 of our book, right? The First 1,000 Words of Latin,
Yeah.
the Amory book.
Yeah.
And the heading is, the category, the genus is itinera, right? Journeys. And I'm looking at orbitae, which are train tracks, currus tractorius, a train. I'm looking at gubernator, the conductor, hamaxosticus mercatus, which is a freight train, a helicopterum, which you can guess what that means, right? But I am not finding rocket.
Probably because it's not just a general way of that most people travel, perhaps.
Maybe that's why it's not in the category of Jeff Bezos and William Shatner,
Exactly.
notwithstanding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Machina mentum, an engine. Lots of good words in there.
Nice.
That's a great anecdote. Arugula Man.
Arugula Man.
All right, Jeff. Well, I think we should leave it there for now and pay the bills.
Sounds good.
This episode is brought to you by Hackett Publishing. The good people at Hackett have been supporting this podcast for more than a year now with generosity and verve. They have offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts and Indianapolis, Indiana, and have been providing fine quality translations of the classics and a variety of other fields to you, the reader, for more than 20 years. Jeff, what are some of the things that you like about Hackett?
I like how accessible their translations are. I like how affordable their translations are. I've used them in class. They are one of the few go-to places where I know that the translation is going to thread that needle between being readable, but also very close to the original language. Their catalog is huge.
Right.
You can find all kinds of interesting stuff there, not just in the classics, but in all corners of the humanities.
Right. So we have a pretty narrow expertise, right, in the classics. Try to go deep in that, but there's a whole world out there of interesting things to read.
Yeah.
Hackett, I'm looking at their website now. They have a new resource on Muslim sources of the Crusader period. So I got a question this week from a former student who was asking me about some of the Muslim influences on Thomas Aquinas and the authors who, were translating and interpreting Aristotle, the Arabic authors, who brought back some of this material. The Crusaders brought it back from the East. And so here's maybe a perfect book to answer some of those questions. What were the Muslim sources during that time period, and what kind of access did they have to the Greek manuscripts, among other things? Right.
That title alone just reminds me of how much I simply do not know.
Right. Well, yeah, me too. But also just the breadth of what Hackett has available.
Yeah.
Another title I'm looking at here is The Rise of the Mongols, 5 Chinese sources. Now, the Mongols did have some interaction with the Roman world at some point. But, there's just so much to learn. And you go to hackettpublishing.com like a kid in a candy store.
That's right. So listeners, go to that website, pick out the text you like, and when you're ready to buy your text, you type in AN2021 in the coupon code box.
That's your coupon code. And speaking of kid in the candy store, right, when you go to Hackett Publishing to pick up your sources, you're looking around for the candy corns, right?
I hate candy corn. What are you talking about?
I know you do. So you get the ones that you want.
Yes, no candy corn.
Right, like Euripides Bacchae with the Elvis cover that you like so much.
I love it. Yep.
And you drop that in your grocery basket.
Yep.
And AN2021 at the checkout.
This episode of Ad Nauseam also brought to you by the Moss Method. I'm here with a man who can tell us all about what that is, Dave.
Right, like no one else in the world. So the Moss Method is a program that I have developed for learning Greek. It can take you from neophyte, little or no knowledge of the language, to erudite in a short amount of time.
Sounds great. How does that happen?
Well, I have developed a program whereby you get in 4 modules, right? Each of 4 modules, more than 40 video lessons where I explain every word, every phrase, every ending, every form of these adapted readings. So instead of just memorizing a lot of grammar and never actually reading a story, which is how many Greek textbooks are designed, this drops you down into a very simple story the very first lesson. And then I explain all the grammar. You get the quick sheets, which show you how to learn the endings and so forth. But once again, I have to stress that all the way along, it is interesting. interesting stories to read.
Sounds great. Now, I got this text from you. It said something like "bla fry monsai." What does that mean?
Well, we're running our Black Friday Monday Cyber.
Oh.
Don't notice the Black Friday Monsai special, whereby you can enroll in the Moss Method Module 1 or 2 with a 15% discount off the sticker price. And this is going to start on Saturday, November 20, which is a week from today.
Coming up.
And we're going to run it for 10 days. So for 10 days, you can say, I want to study Greek in the new year. For example, I want to do it with Dr. Noe. I want to read a fun text. I want to be able to participate in the Friday office hours over Zoom with Dr. Noe. This last Friday, just yesterday, actually, as it turns out, we had people from all over the world coming together to study Greek. We looked at a little New Testament. We looked at some Xenophon. It was a great time. So go to mossmethod.com and then come along with us to learn some Greek.
This episode is also brought to you by Racial Coffee.
No, what? Wait, who's that? Do I have a new co-host now, or what's going on?
No, that would be my daughter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you haven't noticed her in the vomitorium today?
I just noticed just now.
Well, why don't you ask her what she thinks about Racial Coffee?
Sophie, what do you think about Ratio?
I think it's very good.
Do you drink a nice cup every morning?
No, not every morning. I have tried it before.
But you've seen the beautiful machine your dad has there on the counter, right?
Oh, yes, it's very nice.
Yeah, excellent.
Sits right there at the end of the counter.
Yeah.
I don't have to tell her to clean it, right? That's not her job.
No, of course not.
And let's be honest, the Ratio hardly needs any cleaning.
No, it's a work of art.
It is.
I've got the 6, you've got the 8.
Right.
So I love my machine. It's sleek, it's beautiful.
Can you say a few words about the process of how is the coffee made? Because this is an important part of the Ratio experience.
Right. So you get it all set up with your grounds and you fill the water tank. And you hit the button, the lights start to shine, and you get the bloom stage.
The bloom.
And that's where all the nasty gases are expelled.
Into the biosphere.
And then there's the brew stage.
Right.
Yes, where the water is poured over the grounds.
It's really hot water.
Very hot.
0 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit in 20 seconds,
Yes.
something like that.
Very impressive.
Powerful machine.
And then on my machine, the lights blink 3 times. It's ready to go.
Yes, so the little LED that tracks you from bloom to brew to ready.
That's right.
It's a bloom with a brew.
It is a bloom with a brew.
So you don't need to go and get some mass brew-duced coffee at some Bainery, Beagley, Barnery, something.
There's no point to do
it. It doesn't taste good.
No.
And you don't need to buy one of those $20 Dak and Blecker, something like that.
The scorch patters.
Yes, exactly, with the brackish tang and so forth.
Terrible.
That's not going to make good coffee.
No.
Now, what about the price, Jeff? It's not cheap,
It is not cheap,
Yeah,
right.
we call it attainable. But do you think it's a good value?
I think it's a very good value.
Okay.
I know my machine is going to be there in my kitchen for a very long time.
Right.
It might be passed down to my children and their children.
Yes.
It's an heirloom. Right.
So if you want to participate in the Ratio Coffee experience, dear listener, please go to
ratiocoffee.com.
Correct, RATIO coffee.com. Mark Helweg has said that the response to this coupon has been overwhelming.
Yes.
We are so grateful to all of you who are supporting this program and scoring some great coffee. There's a coffee coupon code, right?
There is a ANCO.
ANCO. There you have it. Check it out.
All right, Dave. So as we get back into this, you leave undergrad.
Right.
Now you're off to grad school right
Yes.
away. Did you go to grad school right after undergrad?
I had one semester off because I actually finished in the middle of the year.
That's right.
And I had all of these very noble intentions of keeping up my Latin and Greek and even expanding on it before I go to grad school.
So you didn't? Did you go into like another intense period of independent study? Like
No.
no.
I barely touched the Greek and Latin for 6 or 7 months, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're done with undergrad. I mean, you're kind of everybody's a little bit burned out.
Sure, but I was also terrified of going to grad school and being embarrassed for the ignoramus I felt I was at the time.
I see.
Because when I entered the University of Iowa in the fall of '95, I had done about 8 or 9 semesters of Greek, so a large amount of Greek.
Yep.
But I had only done 2.5 semesters of Latin.
Okay.
I was not very accomplished as a Latinist at all.
And when you went, were you thinking, well, I've had more Greek, so I'm going to kind of follow a Hellenist path? Or,
No. I just got dropped down in the classes that were assigned to me by my advisor.
Yeah.
A wonderful fellow. So
Okay. So how did that go? I mean, how was it?
Right.
How was it different? How was it
brutal.
similar?
It was
brutal.
grueling.
Okay.
I'm sure you had a similar thing. I had the Latin rapid readings course at the time. So Professor Rob Ketterer was teaching rapid readings in Latin. It meant 5 days per week. And we were supposed to read something like, 150 pages of Latin each night.
Wow.
Starting with, the pre-archaic inscriptions, the lapis niger and so forth, and stretching all the way down in the second semester to Augustine of Hippo, right?
Yeah.
So the whole thing, and you got to read tons of this material. So the very first night, I stayed up all night, literally, my first all-nighter, to try to get it was either Terence or Plautus, something like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't make hardly a dent. It was I was going so slowly. And I, showed up the next day, dreary, bleary-eyed, and what am I doing?
Yeah.
And the professor, Ketterer, he says, why do you look like, you're about to die or something? I said, well, because I stayed up all night to get all this read. And he said, well, you don't have to do that.
And he said, what was I supposed to do?
Right. I don't assign 200 pages expecting you to finish them all. But I think that's pretty standard for grad school, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been similar to your experience.
Yeah, I remember a similar kind of thing. It was my first course was an Iliad course, so in Greek, of course, and it was the same kind of thing, just hundreds of lines per night, right? And my professor expected us to be not only to have digested all of that, but to be able to, he could pick out a word and you could explain its gender, number, and case, and its use. And
yeah, you couldn't even do 400 lines of the Georgics.
No, exactly right. So yeah, it was a trial by fire.
Right, but it was a great experience. I read Plautus, I read Terence, Livy, Tacitus, Cicero, the whole corpus.
Yeah.
And I've always felt like I'm just getting a little bit of a sample of one author and then on to the next one.
Yeah.
Now that was quite frustrating, and I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years of my time as a Latin student before I actually finished all of one work of one author.
Is that right?
Yeah. The whole corpus of Catullus, I think, was maybe the first thing. And that's only, 116 poems, if I'm remembering. The second work was I read all of the first Catilinarian, and then all of the second, then all of the third, and so forth. But it wasn't until a couple of years after grad school that I finished the whole of the Aeneid. And, that was a big deal for me.
That is, yeah.
So I started to, expand my knowledge, but I also got to teach at the same time. And I'm still teaching very much the grammar translation method. Learn a rule, apply a rule. Learn a rule, apply a rule.
Yes.
Move on.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So where comes the flip where you kind of said, well, spoken Latin might be the better way to go.
Right. Well, it happened as I was starting to leave grad school and to take my first job. So I got to read the Confessions with someone in the religion department at Iowa. And I was able to read the whole thing in Latin in one semester, which was a lot of Latin for me. And that was the first time that I had, maybe it isn't for some people, but for me, that was a lot of Latin to consume and go through, that entire work. And I was also the TA for this fine scholar, this woman, I can't remember her name. And we used the Knudsvig text, which is published by the University of Michigan, has a purple cover.
Yeah, I know
It's not one of the more popular Latin textbooks. And on the whole, I didn't enjoy it a lot, but one thing I learned from it, which was essential, was to try to think about the sentences as communication and not as puzzles. Right? So each Latin sentence, I learned, has 3 core elements. I can't remember if it's called in that book the kernel or some metaphor, but each Latin sentence has 3 core elements. And if you've studied Latin with me before, you know that I talk about this on and on. It's got the kernel, which is the subject and the verb, something like dicunt, they say. Then it has where the subject's implicit in the verb. Then it has either adverbial modification, right? Lente dicunt, they speak slowly. Or it's got adjectival modification, right? Weary, the men, right? A weary bony, good men speak slowly. Weary bony, lente dicunt, something like that. So that threefold identification, right? The core or the kernel of the sentence, adverbial modification, adjectival modification. I've used that 1,000 times.
Okay.
Since that time. I learned that from that book and began to think about Latin as a means of communication, not as a sophisticated puzzle for me to solve.
Now, the professor that you did this with, were you getting that from her as well, or was it just the book was kind of teaching you?
Well, the book was teaching me, honestly. So she was a good professor. I really am appreciative of her work.
But she was not using a spoken method.
No, not at all. Not at all. But I was beginning to think, okay, Latin is a means of communication. It's not just a puzzle, even though I like solving puzzles, right?
Yeah.
Enigmata, and that was good. So then I began teaching, and then in 2005, right? So in 2005, now I have 3 children of my own, and I wanted to teach them Latin, ex pueritia, right, or ex ab infantia, from the very earliest stages, right? And so I have to think, well, I can't just drop them onto Cicero. I got to teach them a lot of quotidian vocabulary so that they can have an experience that this is an actual language. So I start studying. I start learning the word for fork, fuscinula, and spoon, cochlear, and, nose and ears and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then I get to go to the Conventiculum Lexingtoniense in 2005 with Terence Thunberg, and I met David Morgan, Beatae Memoriae, and some other really fine spoken Latinists. And now I have a model or a goal.
That particular conference, did you just kind of stumble on that, or you were thinking, okay, there's people out there doing spoken Latin, you were aspiring to that?
Right.
Like when you're putting together this vocabulary for your kids, had you looked and said, oh, there are people doing spoken Latin? Okay, you had done.
I started to search. I started to realize, when you start out learning a language, you know nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Then you make it past the first hurdle, and you think, yeah, I'm getting pretty good at this. In fact, now I'm better than anyone who doesn't know it. Just small. But then the more you learn, the more you realize, wow, my knowledge is really deficient.
Yes.
And so there was a stage there, 2003, 2005, when I started to realize, yeah, I may be the expert in any given classroom, and I may be the expert compared to a few other persons. But in terms of the language, do I really know it?
Yeah.
Resounding no.
Yeah, right.
And so I just have to find better teachers.
Right.
So that's been my trajectory ever since. I want to find people who know it much better than I do, so I can learn.
Right. Have you heard that famous anecdote about Wilamowitz, the great German scholar in the 19th century, where somebody asked him about his knowledge of Greek, and he said something like that. It says, with all my learning and knowledge and reading, he says, I probably have the knowledge of ancient Greek of a 6-year-old schoolboy.
Yeah.
It's one of those things like, well, why even bother?
Right. Well, because it's just inherently, it's just thrilling to do.
Yes.
It's so pleasing. And you get access to all these great minds of the past.
Exactly.
Unfiltered, unadulterated, directly. But that can be a really crushing realization, And I've had several of those throughout my time as a student of Latin.
Crushing realizations?
Yes. Yeah. One, I had very carefully tried to teach my children, the names of different vegetables and so forth. And so you got caipai, onions, allium, garlic, opium, celery.
Did you throw arugula in there?
No arugula. And then the word for peas, right? Peas, because you're always trying to get your kids to eat peas.
Yes.
Right? And after many years of studying and teaching them all this stuff, turns out I have been using the form wrong. It only occurs in the plural, pisa.
Pisa.
It doesn't occur in the singular.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Now, maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal. As I'm telling you the story,
Did it help your children eat peas?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But you want to teach them things that are accurate,
yeah.
right?
Right.
Children are very impressionable. It's that, it's in Platonic terms, it's the soft wax of the mind. It takes impressions easily. You don't want to put the wrong thing on there because it's going to be stuck.
Yes.
Practically forever.
Yes, exactly.
So I go to the Conventiculum in 2005. I go back in 2009, and I'm still learning how to speak Latin. So you and I are working on a project.
We are.
Right.
I'm very excited about it.
Yes. It's called, the working title is Farrago, right? Mm-hmm. A hodgepodge. 2,501 original Latin sentences, right?
And these were the ones that you wrote for your children.
That's right.
Yes.
2,501, and they're just very quotidian, lots of everyday vocab. And you're doing the illustrations for this work.
I'm very excited about it. Yeah, it's been a while since I've done some good cartooning. So this is going to be fun.
Syndicated work.
Now,
so,
how long did that take you to write 2,500 plus
original Latin sentences? Well, it was many, many years, but I would typically work on them at off times. I would try to come up with a fresh set whenever I, put to my children these exercises. And
you just kind of kept a list, a database?
Yes. Yeah, I used Google Docs.
Yeah.
And just kept adding to it. And, of course, at the beginning, they were exceedingly simple and sometimes erroneous, right? Because I was learning myself.
Yeah.
And I'd go back and fix and correct. But I learned a whole lot in the process. I learned a tremendous amount. And one of the resources that I used is this Amory book, right? The First 1,000 Words in Latin.
Right.
A lot of online materials as well, including now the very readily available Lexicon Morganianum, which Patrick Owens keeps. And you can go there and you can search. It's so easy, so convenient.
I think I've taken a glance at it. That's got a lot of kind of Neo-Latin.
Exactly.
Right.
Extensive Neo-Latin. You want to know how to say cowboy? right? Armentarius, cowboy.
So maybe the rocket, I could find it in that
He
list?
could have found rocket, of course.
Right.
Arugula Man. Come on. But you put all this stuff together, and you write these sentences, and then people get to use them so that they can actually learn Latin. And then I just tried whenever I had the opportunity, to speak Latin. And I'm still not very good at it, I would say, but I get to know personally some of the best speakers in the world. Remember when we went to Rome in 2016?
I do.
We went and visited the Vivarium Novum.
Yes, fascinating.
And we got a fantastic, friendly reception from Luigi Miraglia, Aloysius.
Yes.
And all the students who are studying Latin there, right?
Right.
And our Calvin students, they absolutely loved it. They were
did.
riveted by it. And it wasn't just the free food.
No,
right?
I mean, the vast majority of our students that went with us didn't know any Latin, but they found it fascinating.
Right. And we listened to a fairly long, brilliant lecture by Luigi, if I'm not mistaken.
I remember
about
that.
Cicero. Yeah. And I was thinking, okay, this is going to get a little dry maybe for some of the kids. But no, they were by and large riveted because this undoes, the falsehood that Latin is not a language. It's not useful for communication.
Yeah, and the songs and the food definitely helped.
Oh, absolutely. It was quite a memorable spread.
Yeah.
So some other persons that have been very helpful are a man named Daniel Peterson, who runs the website Latinitium. And he's a very good spoken Latinist, and he has a lot of fine resources at his site. So a combination of using these resources, composing my own Latin, and then memorization, right? We were going to talk a little bit about memorization.
Yeah. Now, having taught spoken Latin for a number of years and still kind of expanding your own approach.
Right.
I mean, what do you think about kind of just the rote memorization as a teaching, as a learning tool?
Well, I think rote memorization is essential, but the rote memorization of forms, mere forms, I don't think is useful.
Can you explain that?
Right. So the third plural, pluperfect indicative active of do is dederant.
Yes.
Right? Dederant. They had given, right? I don't think having a student memorize dederam, dederas, dederat, dederamus, dederatus, dederant. I don't think that's helpful.
Okay.
But I do think having them memorize one of those words in context, right? Memorizing the form as part of a meaningful expression, right, is very, very useful. So if you say to the child, where are your shoes, right? Ubi sunt tui calcei. The calcei, I think it is. The stress is on the antepenal. Where are your shoes? Then the child can respond with something, or any learner, doesn't have to be a child, which cements the form of the pluperfect, You can say something like, Nescio said, I don't know, but, Nescio said parentes mei, but my parents, eos mihi dederant, right? I don't know, but my parents had given them to me.
Okay, yeah.
So if you contextualize it, then absolutely memorize it, but don't memorize it without context.
Gotcha.
Because it's very hard to learn things without a setting to put them in.
Okay.
Right? Like Cranks for the Memories.
Yes.
William Perkins, way back when.
Yeah, so I'm proud of that one.
That was a good title. That was your title.
Yeah, it was, yeah. So now, as someone who, when I last taught Latin, was still teaching just kind of the, here's a form, explain the form.
Right.
Right. So how would you go about testing a student? If they're learning this contextually,
right.
What would that look like?
Well, you want them, as much as possible, to go from English to Latin. So rather than a passive vocabulary, here's insula, tell me it means island, you can use vocabulary words still, but you put them in English and you have them produce them into Latin. Right?
Okay.
Island, insula. Right. So in the Orberg book that I use so often, there is the verb pulsat, which means to strike. And early on in the book, Marcus Juliam pulsat, Marcus hits Julia. But later on, we have ostium pulsat, right? I think we have medis ostium Lydiae pulsat. Medis knocks on Lydia's door. So pulso, right, can mean to whop someone, or it can mean to, tap on a door.
Right.
So when I go from English to Latin there, if you put knock or hit, now the student has to really think, how is this expressed in Latin?
Yes.
Rather than blithely thinking every Latin word has one English equivalent.
Exactly.
Which is such a hard habit to break.
It is. It really is, right? That whole kind of notion that language is math.
We hate it, don't we?
Yes.
We hates it, says Smeagol.
I think everybody has an element of that.
You're right.
When they approach language, right?
You're right.
What does this mean? And just give me the one answer.
Right. It's there. So I think the memorization is essential. Put as much Latin into your brain as you can and keep it there. And start with things you already know, right? So I have my students memorize, and I have memorized the Symbolum Apostolicum Quod Vocant, right? The Apostles' Creed. I memorize the Lord's Prayer, Oratio Dominica, memorize Psalm 117, Laudate Jehovam omnes gentes, etc. Psalm 100, but also memorable phrases, right? Like this one from Phaedrus that I'm having my students learn now. I may have even learned this from Wheelock, I don't know. Homo doctus in se divitius habet. The learned individual has internal wealth, right? Homo doctus in se divitius habet. That's a very good one.
Yeah.
Or this great phrase from Cicero's Brutus. This is a good one for Latin students in particular to remember, which is nihil est enim simul et inventum et perfectum. Nothing is at the same time discovered and made complete or made perfect.
Yeah.
So you got to have tremendous patience when you're learning things,
Right.
Because you're not going to master it immediately.
Right.
Poetry, maybe not 400 lines of the Georgics, but the first 11 lines of the Aeneid, golden.
Right.
And the first 4 lines of Ovid, throw in a little bit of Cicero. The more Latin you can get into your head, the better.
But it's a good reminder that just the notion of, well, for any language
Right.
that you're going to do your 4 semesters to get your requirement, you're not going to really,
No.
you're not going to be fluent in really anything.
No.
Right?
And frankly, it's not a worthwhile activity. Right, so I'm no longer in the academy anymore. But arguments that everyone should study a foreign language, maybe, but only if they're studying it for the right reason.
Yeah.
And the right reason is not to fulfill a requirement or to do it at a low level for 4 semesters and then say, yeah, I had to take Spanish in college. I
Right.
had to take German. That's pointless.
Yeah.
Take it because it's worthwhile in and of itself. You want to do it.
Right.
Otherwise, do something better with your time.
Right. I think about my best teachers were the ones that, out of the classroom, I wanted to track down and search out things that took me beyond what we were doing in class.
Correct.
Right. To kind of create to instill a kind of curiosity.
Right.
And if you really want to learn a language, you have to have that.
That's right.
Or it's not going to happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, I think we're kind of up against it.
Are we already?
Yeah.
This has been so much fun.
And we didn't even really get to the book.
Which we said at the beginning we were going to?
We mentioned it repeatedly, but we
man.
didn't really examine it. I would just like to point out that the first section of the book is domus.
Domus, the house.
Things in the house. We've got words like linteum, which is a towel. We've got stragulum, a mat. Armarium, where you place your clothes, right? The vestibulum, you can probably guess what that means.
The vestibulum.
The vestibulum.
The little room?
Yeah, the lobby, the foyer.
The foyer, yeah.
So the vestibule, right,
Yep.
is where you take off your clothing, right?
Gotcha.
You throw off your clothing. They have these in the baths at Pompeii, the vestibulum. Got more common words like mensa, the table, scalae, the stairs. But I think we're going to have to leave the majority of this book for the next episode.
So we got to do a part 2.
It's going to be a part 2.
Sounds great.
How to be a Latin guru or a Sven Jolly, part 2. And then we're going to also have a lot of tips, right? A lot of tips about how to take this quotidian vocabulary and incorporate it into your own daily routine.
Excellent.
Drawing from some of the insights of, again, Daniel Peterson, Mike Fontaine, right, who was with us for How to Tell a Joke.
Right.
In Latin. He's done some good work on this. Again, I just want to stress, compared to the guys and gals that know a lot about speaking Latin, I'm pretty low on the totem pole. But hopefully, together we can share some useful things with our listeners.
That sounds great. I'm glad that we ran out of time.
You're glad we ran out of time.
because this was kind of fun. I had to admit, when you proposed this episode, I thought, oh, this is great, and this is right up Dave's alley.
Okay,
I see
how it goes. On your birthday.
But I've been out of the Latin game for a few years now, so I was a little just concerned of, like, what am I going to bring to this?
Right.
But this has been great. It's
Well, you bring what you typically bring: good humor,
Yes.
great questions.
Thank you.
A fine wardrobe.
Excellent. Thank you. That's an excellent birthday gift for me. Right.
Yeah. So we got to wrap it up, don't we?
We do.
Okay.
So let's we got some people to thank.
We got some people to thank.
So Mishka
Fernando.
who's our engineer.
Yep.
Who takes out all the pops and the hisses and
The squarks.
the squarks and
And the bluckos.
and the whips.
Right.
Right.
The scrum screes.
Exactly. Makes us sound professional.
Right.
We got Scott Van Zen
Yes.
and who's the other guy?
Ken Tamplin,
Ken Tamplin,
come
of course.
on.
Right.
The guy owns the internet with his vocal academy.
Yes, for the great music that you hear
Yeah,
throughout.
how to sing like Night Ranger, how to sing like
man.
Anthrax. He does it all.
That guy's got a voice.
He does a 6-7 octave, something like that.
Unbelievable. And you can learn to sing that way.
Oh, you can.
Yeah, check out his vocal academy.
That's right. And Scott plays that blistering guitar. We need to thank Sophia Noe, right?
Of course.
Who helped out a little bit with today's ads.
Yes, and it's just kind of as a general bona fortuna in the room, right?
Right.
Yep.
Yep. So anyone else we need to thank here?
I think that's about it.
Those are about all. Well, we need to thank the listener.
Oh, those people.
They're the elephants in the room, you might say. Elefanti inconclaviensunt.
Very nice.
Right.
Very nice.
We need to thank them for listening.
Of course.
Invite them to send their comments, their criticisms, their harshly worded rebukes
Yep.
to Jeff.
At adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V in
Right.
there.
Or to Dave at adnauseam.com.
And also, I would say encourage the listener to leave a review.
Yes, we would like that.
On the platform of your choice.
Right.
That helps increase the listenership. And,
Right.
And
share it with your friends if there's something in here,
Yep.
that they like, maybe they'd be interested in. We want to keep the classics alive. Join us in cursing the darkness is what we would say.
Exactly. So we're
Yeah.
going to continue this in a part 2.
Yeah, next week. We got part 2 coming up.
And Dave, you have our gustatory parting shot, I believe.
I do, and I really like this one. This is from a man that I admire greatly. His name is George Washington Carver, an American postbellum scientist, and this is from his work, How to Grow the Peanut and 105 Ways of Preparing It for Human Consumption.
That's awesome.
Now, the brilliance of this quote, just to set it up, is this is one of those things you would think, you don't really need to say this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But the plain fact is, you do. So he says, note, always remove the brown hull from the peanuts, even though the recipe does not say so.
Take it from George.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.